Let's talk about scaffolding sexual agency. Now, sexual agency, as we know, is much more than just having, say, autonomy regarding sexual interactions. It's not just about being able to make your own decisions, but it's about genuinely, actually, being able to craft and create the kind of sexual narrative, the kind of sexual experiences, the kind of relationships that one wishes to be having, that actually work for oneself. It's about the effective, the genuine ability to explore various desires or interests or fantasies that one might have if one has these. And it's about genuinely actually being able to not just make choices, but to act on those choices and be respected in those choices regarding whether or not one wants to be engaging in sexual interactions or what kinds of sexual interactions one wishes to be engaging in and with whom one wishes to be engaging in those sexual interactions if one wants to be having them. Sexual agency isn't all or nothing. It's something that you can have to greater or lesser extents. It might be the case that you have, a great deal of control over some aspect of your sexual or romantic life, but much, much, much less control or ability to actively pursue other dimensions of your sexual or romantic narrative. It might be the case that you are able to make certain kinds of choices, that you have the resources to make certain kinds of choices, but that you risk social censure for other kinds of choices. Sexual agency requires a great deal of support in terms of, laws, social norms, our systems of education and access to knowledge, as well as the material features of our world. So let's think about those various, things that can go into supporting and enabling sexual agency. So it's not enough just to have, say, free will regarding sexual matters. If somebody, lives in a social context where it is illegal to be gay, then they might be able to have the free will to decide to act on their sexual orientation or not. But they don't robustly have sexual agency within this context because they aren't supported in acting on their sexual orientation, right? They would face a great deal of, possibly persecution, prosecution, potentially incarceration, and sometimes, depending on what that social context is, even larger scale consequences for acting on their sexual orientation. So when there are legal structures that are inhibiting sexual agency, we don't genuinely robustly have sexual agency in that context. It's not just about our laws, however. Our social norms play a huge role in people's ability to exercise their sexual agency. If it is legal to be gay, but say socially kind of frowned upon, if say there are just like quiet messages about how being gay is strange or embarrassing or shameful. I am not talking about a historical fact, nor am I talking about a far-off possible world. I am talking about the world that many folks currently live in, even within the United States right now. So if one lives in a context where it's risky or dangerous or, again, just sort of viewed as strange or less than perfect, less than ideal to be anything other than straight, all of those messages are going to play a huge role in whether or not people are able to actually pursue the sorts of sexual and or romantic interactions that they might wish to pursue, right? So these kinds of social norms, these kinds of social messages can undermine or inhibit or take away from people's sexual agency. Our social norms matter. If somebody lives in a social world where, women are viewed as sluts if they engage in sexual interactions or are thought to engage in sexual interactions, that is massively going to undermine their sexual agency because it makes it really risky to engage in different kinds of sexual interactions because of the stigma, because of, the kinds of social censure that those sexual interactions risk being subject to. Like, that is a big deal to know that if somebody finds out, that could lead to like all kinds of bullying or harassment. That massively undermines a person's sexual agency. If we are in a social context where sexual violence is treated as not that big a deal, and to the degree that it is frowned upon, it is viewed as the survivor, the person who is targeted by that sexual violence, as if it was somehow their fault. When we live in a social world that engages in that kind of victim blaming, that can massively impede a person's sexual agency. It undermines sexual agency because it means that every kind of sexual interaction might carry a certain sort of risk, that if one's sexual partner or partners, in fact, don't listen if a person says stop, don't listen if they use a safe word, then they know that they, as the person who's being violated, will be blamed for the violation that takes place. If they know that people are going to say, well, oh, you shouldn't have been having sex anyway. What were you thinking in the first place? Or, oh, it couldn't have been that big a deal because you wanted to enter into that sexual interaction, at least at first. So it was probably not that big a deal, right? These sorts of things impede sexual agency. They're also shit-tastic on their own. But one of the things that they do is they make it so much riskier for people to engage in sexual interactions. They make it so that it is much, much, much harder to actually have genuinely lovely, wonderful sexual interactions. Not impossible, but a lot harder. These are the sorts of features of a social world that we might want to change if we want to genuinely support and enable sexual agency. Social norms aren't the only things that make a big difference in terms of folks' sexual agency. Our various epistemic features of our world make a difference to sexual agency as well. If we live in a social world where, say, access to information is hard, maybe it's hard to find out, information about various sexual attraction identities or romantic attraction identities. And so someone just doesn't have access to information that might help them figure out, it turns out I'm actually asexual. Cool, didn't know that before. That is going to be incredibly detrimental to someone's sexual agency. If you don't have access to the information that will help you figure out what you actually do and do not want to be doing in terms of your sexual and or romantic narrative and experiences, that massively inhibits people's sexual agency. If we don't have access to information that will help people understand how sexual interactions might carry different kinds of, potential risks, for example. If somebody doesn't genuinely know how pregnancy or gestation really works and what kinds of sexual interactions might lead to pregnancy or gestation, that is a huge, problem for their sexual agency. Because it means that they might be engaging in sexual interactions that they wouldn't have wished to engage in if they had that information, right? And that makes it a lot harder to craft the sort of narrative that one wishes to craft. So we need to have various, different kinds of educational resources. We need to have access to different kinds of information in order to genuinely support and enable sexual agency. It's not just about our legal systems, nor our social norms, nor the various sets of information that we have access to. We also need to attend to material features of our social world and how those can help to either inhibit or enable sexual agency. So if somebody is in a social context where they can't actually access, say, various kinds of contraception, maybe let's just stick to condoms for a moment. And let's even be more specific. Let's think about an instance where there is a college campus where it is really hard to get condoms anywhere near that college campus. Condoms are available if you walk or drive much farther away, but near the campus, there's just nowhere that sells or provides condoms. Think about how that's going to affect the students on that campus. It's going to be a lot harder to get to make a choice about using or not using condoms if they aren't even materially available. If it's important to someone to use condoms, and it's important to a lot of people to use condoms, but they're just really hard to get, that's going to be a huge barrier to actually having the sorts of sexual or romantic interactions that that person wants to be having. Similarly, if somebody is in a geographic location where there just aren't very many physical spaces to be able to have sexual interactions without the threat of people walking in or people seeing, and maybe even getting in trouble for having those sexual interactions. Well, those material features of the world, not having a space, a safe space to have those sexual interactions, that is going to massively impede people's sexual agency. Okay, so sexual agency requires scaffolding. It requires support. It requires all of these different kinds of legal, social, educational, and epistemic, and material support for people to genuinely be able to craft their own sexual experiences, their own sexual lives, in the ways that they wish to, and in the ways that are going to allow for meaningful, pleasurable, and desired experiences, whether that means engaging in sexual experiences or not. I'm just going to keep reiterating, sexual agency is relevant to everyone. And if we think that it's important, then it requires genuinely thinking about what sorts of systems and structures we currently have in place in our social world, and what sorts of things we might need to do differently, both on a large scale and on a much smaller scale. So it's worth thinking about what sorts of little changes we could make in our lives, as well as the large structural changes that we might think need to be made. Sexual agency isn't something that we can just say, great, we are sex positive. You now have sexual agency. It requires actual, robust, both legal, social, educational, and material changes. Right? So if we are not setting up our world in order to support people's ability to shape their sexual lives in ways that they actually find meaningful and pleasurable, we are not living in a social world that supports sexual agency.